We're getting closer and closer and closer to the most positive time of the year where I can appreciate music that I've been in love with for the most part, or at least music that I think deserves a mention if it isn't in my top spot, which is what this video is for. Don't forget to leave your suggestions in the comment box down below. I want to know what you've been listening to that you think is good, but just not quite good enough to make your end-all be-all lists for the year 2022. I'm going to start off with a guilty pleasure of mine being Vory's Lost Souls. He's a very talented singer, much in the same vein as like a Post Malone. Instead, he talks a lot more through his singing, trying to display or tell a tale more than just serenade you or trying to show off his vocal acrobatics. It's a guilty pleasure record of mine because I don't think much of the content on here is anything that's new. Musically, we're tapping into very obvious inspirations, and some of it is fuckboy music, but when it sounds good, it sounds good. Redville's Learn to Swim album, I think, is great. And at this point from Redville, there's only a couple of things that he needs to polish up on before I would easily put him into a top spot for a year-end list. He's become that much better, that much more interesting, that much more focused, and that much better of like a song builder. If I have to say anything about Redville, is literally just developing a story and living longer to talk about more content. That's really it. He's got all the foundations of what I believe to be an amazing MC within the next few years, and I'm glad that I've been able to follow him for as long as I have, track that progress and see where he started from essentially to where he is right now. Earthgang with Ghetto Gods. I like this album. The only thing that's keeping me from putting it in the top spot is really just the focus isn't as clear as it was on Mirrorland for me, which is my favorite Earthgang record to date. Though Mirrorland starts to lose some of its focus near the latter part of the album, I think it has such a strong start. Hard to overlook the chemistry of a Dot and a Johnny as they whimsically run through the entire album with massive personality, some funny one-liners, great flows, really colorful deliveries. None of that has changed on Ghetto Gods. It's just a little less focused thematically than I'd like for it to be. It just doesn't seem to have that same level of identity that the previous record did. That's all. That's the only thing holding it back for me. 42 Dugg and ESTG with Last Ones Left had everything going for it. The first 5 tracks of this dual collab mixtape album, whatever you want to call it, are some of the best moments I feel hip hop and trap has had to offer this whole year. Banger after banger after banger. These two are relentless. Fun record. I don't think they took it too seriously. I do think it loses a lot of its steam very early on, but the records here that they do to death, I think are some of the best records that came out this year. Not only from the two of them, but just period. Had they shortened this album down to 7 to maybe 9 tracks, easily would have put it in my top albums this year. Quavo and Takeoff with Only Built for Infinity Links. There's a couple records that I really enjoy off this, and the records that I don't love aren't bad and still manage to maintain the vibe of what the Migos is at its core, despite only being Unk and Neff. It can take some adjusting because one of my favorite members, Offset, isn't on the record, but once you get used to it, it's not that big of a problem. Freddie Gibbs with Soul Separately. I wanted to put this one in here because although I think it's a pretty good Freddie Gibbs record, I think it doesn't have nearly as much of that creativity that I love from Freddie Gibbs off of previous records like Bandana, like Alfredo. While I do think this is a good record, I don't think it highlights a lot of Freddie Gibbs' personality that is highlighted on those earlier records. I think there's a much more attempt at going mainstream or being more palatable with this record, which kind of dumbs it down a bit or muddies the waters a little bit more. So we end up getting some generic kind of trap songs on the album where I otherwise would expect some really great musical adventures from Freddie Gibbs. It's good, but listening to Freddie Gibbs' output, you know he can do better. Rosalia with MOTOMAMI, I think, is a great record as well. Only thing that holds it back is really just the lack of direction for me. There's so many great song ideas here. I would have loved this album if she took more of the Lido Pimiente approach, kind of made it like a cultural ode. At an attempt to try so many new things, I think it stretches itself too thin, going into almost what I feel is too many different spaces for me to enjoy from start to finish. Most of them are quality records though, just not always my preference. Babyface Ray with Face. I want to put Face in my top spot for albums this year as well, but I can't because Mob is actually just like a more consistent record for me, but it's still a really good representation of Babyface Ray's style and a stronger statement than his previous output, Unfuckwittable, which I really enjoyed and put in my honorable mentions for last year as well. Though I think it displays a good portion of Babyface Ray's skill set, I think a bit of his personality is muted underneath how chill and laid back he comes across on a lot of these songs. A problem that I don't necessarily see on Mob, maybe because the musical palette is a bit more pronounced on that album. More Love, Less Ego, I think is a weaker statement than Made in Lagos from Wizkid, but still is a good cultural representation of where he is from without diluting it too much, still being a vibe, still being interesting, still not overstaying its welcome, but falling into the background just a bit more than the previous. Shiro Sagasu's Bleach songbook is such a great time capsule. For those who don't know, I'm a huge Bleach fan, and when it was announced that Bleach was coming back, I was ecstatic. The final arc is actually about to be animated. But the one thing I was most excited for was the compositions, the soundtracks. I wanted to know how these soundtracks would fit into the new way that Bleach would be portrayed. And I gotta tell you, having these remixes and these additions and these slight alterations to music that I already loved in the Bleach anime itself just made me feel really good. They aren't cheap additions either. They're actually like reinterpretations of great songs that I think made some of those moments in the anime itself so great. Another one I gotta give some shine to is the God of War Ragnarok soundtrack. That shit was fire. Listening to this soundtrack, you'd never guess it was for a video game. Ragnarok perfectly sonically displays the intensity of the war that happens within the game, and I just love that. Oggy's Monologues EP, I think, is just a great little representation of her skill set. Some really nice, softly sung displays of her songwriting. Despite coming off like such a soft singer, though, she still has quite a bit of personality and is pretty charismatic as well. Unirule's Sicario album, he dropped 2 records this year, and although I like Sicario a lot, it isn't eviscerated. There are plenty of moments on the Sicario album that have me thinking, if done right, hyperpop and rap fusions will easily be one of the most popular forms of expression within the next year or so. If done to this degree, as rhythmic as it is, as catchy as it sounds, it's an earworm, it's infectious. I love it. Drake with Her Loss, although I'm not probably going to be listening to Her Loss for that much longer, there are some of Drake's best moments on this record. Some of his best in years. I mean, since if you're reading this, is too late. Really great rapping in some moments. 21 is a good safety net for Drake, I feel, as well. I mean, the moments on this album that are bad are boring. Very, very boring. But outside of maybe one record, I couldn't call any of it trash. And last but certainly not least, and I know people are going to give me shit for this, is Kendrick Lamar's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. I will tell you right now, I am not including this record in my top albums of this year because I'm saying the other records are so much better. I do not enjoy this album, and I've told you this already. There's going to be some records that come along that I'm just not feeling. Now, my preferences for not wanting to relive traumas in the form of music aside, I think Kendrick Lamar with Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers solidifies himself as one of the greatest rappers of all time. I'm talking better than Pac, better than Biggie, better than Hove, better than a lot of the niggas that you have called classics and artists that no new generation artist will ever topple or stand atop. With how vulnerable, how descriptive, how much depth that Kendrick Lamar goes into on this album, he's easily one of the most prolific, thoughtful, and detailed writers I've ever listened to, just period. But as I said in my final review for the album, I respect this album far more than I enjoy it. Outside of some of the instances where I feel Kendrick Lamar misses the mark, I'm at the stage in my life where music isn't the therapy to these issues that Kendrick Lamar is talking about, despite how much effort he clearly puts into all of the songs. But this isn't a re-review of the album. If you want to hear my final thoughts, if you missed it at some point, there's a video to it, but I want to reserve those spots for albums that I love so much that I probably won't stop listening to them for quite a few years to come. And as great as Kendrick is, I just don't feel that way about Mr. Morale. But that's all I got. You know, for my honorable mentions of 2022, y'all feel free to let me know what records you have listened to that, again, you think are good, just not great enough to belong in those top album spots. Tomorrow, I will be coming with the top 50 songs of 2022. I'll see y'all.